Hello! Welcome to the Wisconsin High School Theater Festival's 2020 State One Act Competition. Congratulations on being a part of this very exciting and very strange celebration of high school theater. I hope you, your friends, and your family stay healthy and happy during these times. My name is Simonson, and I will be leading your Shakespeare 101 workshop today. Like you, I attended the State One Act Festival when I was in high school and actively participated in many workshops and watched schools from all over the state perform. I attended the University of Wisconsin Parkside's theater program in 2015 and graduated this last August. During my time at Parkside, I had the opportunity to study acting, directing, design, and movement, as well as had the opportunity to study abroad at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, where I narrowed my specialization to Shakespearean and Jacobean theater. I am currently a for-hire director throughout the Milwaukee and Northern Chicago theater belt while returning to school at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater to get a secondary undergraduate degree in theater education. Over the years, I have spent a lot of time focusing my studies into Shakespeare and his works. I often choose to direct his shows over anything else and coach people in their monologues. The knowledge and skills I will be bringing to you today come from a wide variety of collegiate and professional experience, as well as tips and tricks that I think can help beginners in the field. As you move forward in your development, you'll find other methods that you might find work better for you as an artist. For today, we're going to learn about Shakespeare, about his works, and the best way to approach his texts wherever you're starting out. William Shakespeare, also known as the Bard of Avon, has a debated birthday. Records found dated him as being baptized on April 26th, which most commonly happened within the first 3 days of a child's birth. Experts have come to a conclusion that he was most likely born on April 23rd. Subsequently, 52 years later, on the same day, William Shakespeare died. His monument, which stands in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, doesn't bear his name, but instead his date and death in a poem, which reads, "Good friends of Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed by the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." He was born in, went to school in, had his family in, primarily lived in, and died in Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, England. Stratford is a town with roots as far back as the Middle Ages, and today remains a small city and home to the Royal Shakespeare Company. Shakespeare eventually began living part-time in London, where he was an actor, writer, poet, and eventually founded the Globe Theatre on the River Thames. In his lifetime, he is credited to have written 37 plays, 4 poems, and 154 sonnets, with theories that there are more works lost to time and credits of other pieces not given to him. Today, he is recognized as the English national poet. Shakespeare's legacy stands as the most unique in history as compared to other writers and dramatists from any era. He is the most commonly recognized, performed, and studied. A colleague of his who worked with him, Ben Jonson, most appropriately stated that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. So, why was Shakespeare the most successful playwright of human history? What made his work so different and unique than anyone else's? It's a common discussion amongst the academic world about the success of Shakespeare. It's known that some of his famous shows mimic stories and themes that have been around long before Shakespeare, and therefore some people question the quality. In some more extreme cases, his success was so powerful that some people believe Shakespeare wasn't even a real person, instead a group of dramatists all writing under a pseudonym. However, since we do know he was real, and we know he typically worked alone, the reason why he was the most successful was because even though his stories weren't all completely original, he was a perfect storyteller. For his time, his writing was beyond revolutionary. He wasn't focusing on abstract subjects, but instead on human emotions and conflicts. His ability to write in a descriptive and imaginative format was hypnotic for people at the time, and since he was light years ahead of any other writer, his level of intellect is something that hasn't been able to be matched. His stories have survived the test of time. By focusing his stories around humans and not situations, any adaptation of his show can be understood by anyone, regardless of their background. Shakespeare's parents were John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. Shakespeare had a total of 7 siblings, only 5 of which made it to adulthood. William was the oldest. John was a well-established member of the Stratford community with a very high status. This gave John and Mary the opportunity to send their children to the local grammar school. When he turned 18, he elected to not continue his education and married a local woman from his town, Anne Hathaway. At the time, Anne was 26 and pregnant with their first child, Susanna. Together, a few years later, they had twins, Hamnet and Judith. We have records of the twins being baptized in 1858, but no documentation of what Shakespeare was doing until 1592, when a pamphlet written about Shakespeare was printed in London. Scholars refer to this gap of time as Shakespeare's lost years. His 2 first printed works were long poems in 1593 and 1594. Shortly thereafter, he became a founding member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a famous company of actors. He worked as both an actor and their leading dramatist, producing 2 plays a year for them for nearly 20 years. During this time is when he had written nearly all of his works, including King Lear, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. His wealth and success gave him the opportunity to buy a large manor for his family back in Stratford-upon-Avon, called the New Place, in 1597, and by 1599, construction of the world's most famous theater was complete. The first Globe Theater was built on a plot of land that formerly housed a small theater. The owners of the land offered 5 people of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, including Shakespeare, £10 each to have a stake in establishing a new one. On the south bank of the River Thames, the Globe was established. The theater was built in Southwark, as it was outside of the control of city officials, who were often hostile towards theaters. 2 theaters already stood there, the Rose Theater and the Swan Theater, both which still stand there today. The frame was built from timber, and the walls were plaster and hair. The roof was made from thatched, dried reeds. They went with the cheapest building materials possible at the time. The first play believed to be performed when the Globe opened was a production of Julius Caesar. For 14 years, the Globe housed many performances with incredible success. On the night of June 29, 1613, during a production of Henry VIII, cannons actors were firing that were using real gunpowder ignited the roof of the theater. Within an hour, the entire theater burned to the ground. Miraculously, nobody was hurt during the fire. Newspapers had stories running about it for days. But, not long after, the Lord Chamberlain's Men built a new theater right on top of the foundations of the last one. This one was more extravagant than the first, made with better materials, and they decided to go with a tile roof instead of a grass one. The structure of the Globe was actually not round, but 20 sides. It was 3 levels tall and could hold approximately 3,000 spectators. There was a rectangular stage against one wall that stood 5 feet high and projected halfway into the yard. The yard was a large open space in the middle of the theater, and where there would normally be seats for the audience to sit, it was open and people paid as little as 1 pence to stand in the yard and watch the show. These spectators were thus referred to as groundlings. There were 2 main entrances on the ground that would lead directly to the yard for the general public to enter without intermingling with higher affluent theater goers. If you had the money to be able to sit in the seats that circled the stage, there were separate entrances for every level. Corridors circled the circumference of the theater for people to easily navigate the space. The middle gallery was referred to as the 2-penny room, which was more expensive seating. Then, next to that, was the expensive gentlemen's rooms, or lord rooms, which were private boxes. The stage itself was made of nothing more than a simple pop-up thrust that traveling companies would use. A fabric hanging was put up around the base of the stage to cover the legs of the thrust, as well as what they called the hell under the stage. This was a large space directly under the stage that was used primarily for entrances of ghost and supernatural characters. The trap for the hell was in the center of the stage floor. There were 2 stage doors that opened directly up facing the audience. There were no wings or curtains to hide most entrances. In the middle, there typically hung a curtain to use as another optional entrance. Above all these entrances was a gallery, also a part of the set. This would be the famous balcony in Romeo and Juliet. Sometimes, if this part of the set wasn't needed, musicians would sit up there, or even was rented out to the most famous and wealthy spectators. Unlike most shows today, when you attended the Globe, you wanted to sit as close to the stage as possible, but didn't necessarily have to see the actors on stage. Shakespeare's plays were typically meant to be listened to and not always seen. The most expensive seats lined the sides of the stage, where you could hear actors clearly, but not see them. The backstage area for the actors were called the tiring house, where they covered their transitions. There was a door that led directly out of the back of the theater to shield actors from the public. Dressing rooms were on the second level, behind the gallery, and on the third floor was the storage for costumes, set pieces, and props. Near the very top was what they referred to as the hut, in which actors had more space to store things or camp out if they weren't needed on stage for a long period of time. Finally, there was the heavens, the counterpart to the hell. The majority of the stage was covered by a large ceiling that had complex paintings of the moon, sun, and stars. Two very large and ornate pillars held up the heavens. Typically, only the groundlings could see the complexity and detail of the heavens. And every night, a playhouse flag was hoisted up the pole to advertise which show was playing that evening. During the run of the Globe, 2 outbreaks of the bubonic plague closed their doors. However, in 1642, near the beginning of their Civil War, Parliament ordered the close of London theaters. Puritans wanted the land, and in 1644, the Globe was demolished and on it was constructed housing structures. Puritans went even further to arrest and torture actors if they were found performing. It wasn't until 1660, when Charles II was restored to the throne, that the Puritans lost their power and theaters were restored. The Globe, however, was gone. In 1970, American actor and director Samuel Wanamaker set up the Shakespeare's Globe Trust to begin a reconstruction of the Globe Theater, all from donations. For nearly 30 years, they worked to raise money, obtain permits, worked with scholars and architects to best recreate the Globe that once stood. And in 1997, only 1 street away from where the first 2 Globes were built, the third and final Globe Theater opened its doors. It is a near-perfect replica of the first. It includes benches in the galleries and a yard where you can go and watch a show. There have been some minor changes, like having lighting and running water, but attending a show at the Globe Theater today will give you the feeling of if you were there hundreds of years ago. It's truly an experience like no other. If you are ever fortunate enough to watch a show at the Globe, don't buy a seat up in the stands, do as the groundlings did and stand in the yard. It's the best time you'll ever have. When Shakespeare passed away in 1616, there was no collection of his found that contained all of the shows he had written. Since this time period was filled with mostly illiterate people, he rarely sent any of his plays to publish. Afraid of losing his great stories written, Shakespeare's colleagues John Heminges and Henry Condell set to work obtaining every part of every script they could find. Back then, actors didn't receive an entire copy of the script, as they were written by hand. Instead, an actor would receive a collection of pages with only a cue line for their entrance and the lines they were to speak. So, the 2 men, along with many others, had to find every copy of every character from every show. By 1623, they amassed and pieced together 36 of Shakespeare's shows and printed Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies, otherwise known today as the First Folio. The First Folio originally had roughly 700 to 1,000 copies printed, but today, around only 230 survive. The Folger Library in Washington, D.C. has approximately 80 original prints on display. Thanks to the quick thinking and hard work of these men, we have the most reliable way to read and study Shakespeare's text. The First Folio was believed to be typed out by 5 different writers, all with different spellings and levels of competence from the original manuscript, collected and edited by Heminges and Condell. Researchers have labeled them A through E, based on a scale of A being the most accurate and E being significant issues. 134 out of 900 pages of the manuscript copy were believed to be proofread. The rest weren't. This has proven to show some discrepancies between use of punctuation and spelling. The first folio separated out Shakespeare's shows by 3 categories: comedy, tragedy, and history. However, there are a select number of shows that people argue don't fit under the category of comedy it's placed into, nor as a tragedy. Scholars have created a subcategory known as tragicomedy to better fit the tone of the show. However, this category isn't formally recognized. Without the first folio, over half of Shakespeare's work would be lost to us today. To buy a bound copy of the first folio in 1623, they sold for £1, enough in that time to buy 44 loaves of bread. It's understandable why most wouldn't have wanted to purchase a copy. Shakespeare himself has a lot of fun trivia not only about himself, but about the shows he wrote as well. To begin with, Shakespeare didn't write his histories in chronological order. Instead, he began with Henry VI, Part 1. And at the time it was written and produced, it wasn't advertised to have a second part written. When we take a look at his tragedies, Titus Andronicus was his first one written and is also the bloodiest, with 14 on-stage deaths and over 30 more alluded to. His second bloodiest is King Lear with 10, and Hamlet takes third with 9. Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet, died when he was only 11 years old, sending Shakespeare into a deep depression. He briefly spent time in Bedlam, England's most notorious mental institution from the Elizabethan era. His grief spurred many of his famous tragedies, like Macbeth and, not surprisingly, Hamlet. During this time, he also began to write for higher affluent crowds and began to charge audiences more to see productions. In some cases, he wrote shows to fit an understanding of a more wealthy crowd. Shows like Hamlet were written to take place within a castle, and, subsequently, this production, along with others, moved to perform for the royals in England and were performed in their castles. In his time, he performed for both Queen Elizabeth I and King James II. Language also notably switched to being a balance between both prose and poetry that characters could swap between, showing higher intelligence. Finally, his last 4 plays that he wrote independently were referred to as his final 4. These plays included Cymbeline, The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, and Pericles, Prince of Tyre. These shows exhibited a massive shift in Shakespeare's psyche and demonstrated the importance of familial relationships, forgiveness, rebirth, reunions, and all had an undertone of supernatural influences. It is thought that since these shows were written during his final years of life, he was reflective upon the stories of humanity he wanted to tell to the world, mainly the love for family and the importance of being a bigger and better person. Shakespeare would continue to write, but is credited with collaborating on shows with other writers and not being a sole dramatist. So, now that we know a little bit more about the man and have talked about some fun facts about his shows, let's dive into how we approach a show. It doesn't matter where you are in your familiarity with Shakespeare and his texts. You always have room to grow and learn more about him. When you begin working on a new show, always remember that you have to work on learning your text. Remember, Shakespeare's shows were written to be heard. An audience won't understand the show if you don't understand it. There are many sources out there that can help you break down shows line by line. If you don't know what you're saying, don't be afraid to look it up. And even if you do, always double check it. You'll be surprised with what you might end up finding. Even today, when I'm doing text work, I often operate with resources to assist and help guide me along my way so I know I'm not misguided. When you get cast in a Shakespeare show, the director will already have picked out the version of the script they want. But if you're looking for monologues or want to study the show on your own, there are good and bad versions to pick. If you want the purest version of the show, always go with the first folio. It has the original punctuation and verbiage. Other options you can pick from are the Arden Shakespeare, Oxford Library, Folger Library, and Riverside Shakespeare. These 4 are all respected by scholars and don't stray from the original folio. They even come with helpful definitions of vocabulary or references to help guide you on your way. If there are specific words you don't know, use the Shakespeare lexicons, a pair of dictionaries that define every word in every show by definition based on the context it's put in. Shakespeare has been translated across every language, been adapted to sign language, and even Klingon. But there are bad translations that mess with text, punctuation, or even change the words altogether. A good example of a bad translation comes from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where they have come under fire for trying to adapt Shakespeare into modern colloquial English, not only losing the flair and originality that came from his words, but also trying to turn every show into 10 Things I Hate About You or She's the Man. Always be sure to use copies of Shakespeare's work that are approved by scholars. Don't trust any edits you find on just any website, as they are very easy to alter. You can find complete scripts of his shows on the Folger Library's website that allow you to download them for free, and the best database for any and all monologues from Shakespeare can be found on shakespeare-monologues.org. So, you found a script. How do you read it? The simple answer is, just as you read anything else. The biggest mistake you can make while working with Shakespeare is being afraid of his words. It can look intimidating and can seem impossible to know where to begin. But if you lose the stigma that this is in a different language, you've won half the battle. I promise, if you know what you're saying as an actor, any audience member, regardless if they know the story, will understand you. These are some simple tricks you can do to start your journey. First, read your lines out slowly. Take your time sounding out all the syllables. As you go along, I guarantee you there's going to be a moment where you zone out and realize you haven't been understanding what you've been saying. So, go back, find the spot you last remember, and try to deduce why you checked out. Was it a word that confused you? Was your character telling a long story and you didn't find it interesting? This can be the first step to understanding your text as an actor. It's also great to find as early as you can the roadblocks you'll be facing when you begin rehearsals. The next step is going to go and circle all the words you don't immediately recognize and double check the ones you're confident about. Words can have multiple meanings depending on the show you're in. For example, let's take the word trumpet. The first and most obvious definition is a wind instrument of music. But in Othello, Desdemona's line of, "I did love the more to live with him, my downright violence and storm of fortunes may trumpet to the world," thus changing the definition to publish or proclaim. Both definitions are correct, but they have different meanings because of the show you're in. This is just one of thousands of examples of words that could trip you up when you're beginning to understand your text. If you have a copy of the Arden, they have subnotes on every page that can walk you through step by step. Or, even No Fear Shakespeare can help you get a general understanding of your show. The final thing you are going to need to do is the most involved. You need to begin your scansion work. Scansion is something unique to Shakespeare and his verses. First, you need to make sure you understand the difference between verse and prose. Shakespeare often writes in both. A character that speaks in verse is higher intelligence than one that speaks in prose, and a character that can switch between the two casually is considered to be the most intelligent. Verse is often as you'd expect it to be, rhyming lines usually in pairs of two. However, verse can also be non-rhyming. Another easy way to tell if it is verse or prose is by looking at the capitalization at the beginning of every line. If each line starts capitalized, it's verse. If it's not, it's prose. The two are pretty easily identifiable. Scansion work is typically only done for monologues written in verse. Scansion doesn't work when it's applied to prose writing, and using it for single lines of dialogue isn't usually common for actors to do. Scansion work is made up of several parts. I'm going to list them first and explain them, and then I will show you a couple examples of how we would break it down. The first part of working with scansion is understanding iambic pentameter. If you know how to count syllables in words, you've done half the battle already. Iambic pentameter is a rhythmic pattern that mimics natural speech and found primarily in Shakespeare. The best way to understand the sound of iambic pentameter is thinking of a horse gallop. The rhythm goes da-dum, 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 da-dum. There are 10 syllables in almost every line. Occasionally, he might stray and have 9 or 11. When you're working on your monologue, you note your lines using symbols to mark the stressed and unstressed syllables. The stressed syllable is a dash, and the unstressed syllable looks like a capital letter U. Here's an example of a line we can break down. But to my mind, though I am native here. Even in a normal speaking tone, I'm sure you can hear the rhythm. Let's slow it down a little bit more. But to my mind, though I am native here. Do you hear that gallop? But to my mind, though I am native here. Now, let's add in our notes. But to my mind, though I am native here. Unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, so on and so forth. 10 syllables. Now let's add the next line. Let's sound out the syllables. And to the manner born, it is a custom. So, this is a case where there are 11 syllables. There's nothing wrong with it not meeting the 10 syllable count, but make sure you are sounding out each of your words correctly to make sure you're not overcounting. Take this line, for example. Of each new hatched, unfledged comrade, beware. Do you see how some of these words are contracted? Specifically, the ED is dropped from the end. So instead of counting it as one syllable, it melts into the previous syllable. Here's how it would sound without the contractions. Of each new hatched, unfledged comrade, beware. Now, when we sound it out, there are 12 counts. Let's try it the way Shakespeare wrote it. Of each new hatched, unfledged comrade, beware. Now we're back to 10. This contraction of words leads me to my next point, focusing on punctuation. Punctuation is one of the biggest parts of Shakespeare's writing and arguably why referring to the first folio is the most reliable way to analyze your work. When it comes to his writings, the most common punctuation marks you're going to find are commas, periods, question marks, and semicolons. It was very rare when Shakespeare used an exclamation point. Your punctuation is your guide map to how you should perform. Periods, question marks, and semicolons are full stops. When you are performing, these full stops are usually when you want to take a breath and continue speaking. If you take a breath on a comma or in the middle of a line, you will break the flow he's got written. Sometimes that might be difficult, as you'll often find that he was notorious for having run-on sentences only strung together by a series of commas. Commas are put in place when your character is shifting their thoughts, but remaining on the same train of thought. No commas in a sentence show a very well thought out character. One or two in a longer sentence is more prone to a character facing some slight confusion or uncertainty. If there are many commas and it's a run-on sentence, it's a good example that a character might be facing a mile-a-minute decision and conflict. Here are 3 examples from sentences from Shakespeare shows. The first one at the top has 3 commas. It's a bit more calm and collected, but obviously building to something big, as demonstrated by the exclamation point. 3 commas showing shifting in their path, but not leaving the train of thought. Then a semicolon, demonstrating a full stop, and a shift into a final explosive thought. Here's another example. We've got 1 full sentence with a full stop, followed by 2 lines, ended with a comma to show a slight shift, into 1 final thought ended by a semicolon. This is a very straightforward thinking moment for this character. Finally, our last example. Here's a single sentence with 7 commas showing moving thoughts as this character continues their speech. It shows they're being very thoughtful and often doubling down or backing off of their previous statement. Just knowing these basics, and knowing what they mean is a great point to start your journey on understanding what your character is trying to communicate to the audience. After we learn our iambic pentameter and punctuation, the final part comes to checking for capitals in a sentence. If you see a word capitalized, unless it's at the start of a line for a verse, it's important. It could be referencing a character, a place, or other important things that might be allusions to religious or real-world attributes. This is another good reason as to why checking back to the first folio is always good when breaking down a monologue. There could have been a translator who dropped a capital letter not thinking it held significance, or added one when there shouldn't be. If you find something capitalized that isn't something you're familiar with, look it up. Shakespeare often made references to major historical events, people, and stories. He often alludes to these things in his monologues. Basically, make sure you get the reference. Here's an example of a breakdown of a monologue I worked on years ago. You'll see I've bracketed sections of lines and defined them in terms that I can better understand. Sometimes, even if you define every word, you don't always understand the point your character is trying to make. So try to break things down and translate them into simpler terms. And make sure that you always remember to annotate what you've discovered, because sometimes you might make a big breakthrough and forget about it later. Anything you choose to write in your script you should always save, because if you ever choose to return to come back to the show or monologue, you've got a great cheat sheet for your future. I'm sure this all seems like a lot of work just to understand a monologue. And in the beginning, it will be. But the more familiar you get with Shakespeare, his writings, and his works, the easier it will be for you to pick up a script and analyze it in a third of the time it took you in the beginning. For me, today, I find it as much easier after practicing and rehearsing these techniques for years than when I first began. But these techniques can open up other doors for you in the future when you begin to learn how to break down text. Maybe some of these tips and tricks will work for you, or maybe you'll find some others that work better. It's all about how you, the artist, can learn and grow and expand your mind while being faithful to the text. And just because the text is old doesn't mean your show has to be. Shakespeare can get a bad rap in high school, as I'm sure you've all suffered through Romeo and Juliet in some capacity. But don't be so put off by him. He's got a show for every genre or mood you're feeling. Want something funny? Try A Midsummer Night's Dream. Do you want a scary ghost story? Macbeth is a great place to start. If you want a soap opera, try Love's Labour's Lost. Shakespeare's shows have found many beautiful homes in theaters all over the world, taking colorful and unique interpretations of his text to tell a story that fits their crowds. No matter where you look, Shakespeare has made his stake in society, even outside of theater. I encourage you to take what you know about Shakespeare and expand on it as far as you can go. I promise you, the only limit you can find will be your own imagination. And well, that's it. I hope everyone learned a lot about Shakespeare today. Remember to always grow and seek more knowledge and to keep working and worshiping your art. It will take you further than anything. Thank you all for joining me today. If you ever have questions or want help or advice on building your image or on the bard himself, I am reachable through my website, my professional email, or via my professional social media account. And if you like today's workshop, I do more in person. If any of your teachers would ever like to book me for workshops, I do professional development sessions, Shakespeare and Jacobean theater, and tons of other fun things. Don't hesitate to reach out. Again, congrats on making it to the Wisconsin High School Theater State One Act Festival. I hope you all have fun watching people from all over the state perform and learn with you. Break a leg.